This is Stories from Palestine podcast. My name is Crystal and this is episode 17. I'm still working on the special podcast episode Christmas in Bethlehem. It will be available on the 21st of December, just before the Christmas holidays. And I thought that this time of year is a good time to ask for some extra support for the podcast. So I came up with the Christmas action. You can support Stories from Palestine podcast this month in two ways, but with only one effort. If you want to do a Christmas donation and help me financially to continue creating new content and getting better equipment and just generally help me make an income, because this is the only way right now for us tour guides to do online work, then I will send an email with Christmas or holiday greetings to your friends and family with a link to the Christmas podcast. And in this way, you help the podcast financially and you help it to grow a new audience. And if you don't prefer to share the email addresses of your friends and family with me, then I can send you the email and you can forward it yourself, no problem. Just go to the website storiesfrompalestine.info, read more about the Christmas action, or go straight to ko-fi.com, ko-fi.com/storiesfrompalestine, and it will explain you there what to do. 3 weeks ago, we had a travel episode from Bethlehem to Jericho. And I've had people asking me to continue with this visit to Jericho because they were waiting for the arrival in Jericho, but we never reached there. So that's why episode 17 is the continuation of the trip to Jericho. The trip to Jericho was done with the Bethlehem Bible College as part of our tour guide study program. And we started from Bethlehem. We went through Beit Sahur. We passed through Wadi Nar, remember the Valley of Fire. And then we passed by Ma'ali Adumim, the settlement named after the road of the Red Slope. We visited the Good Samaritan Inn with the Mosaic Museum. And then we went to Nabi Musa, the place of the tomb of Prophet Moses. And now we are going to continue down the road towards the lowest point on earth, where the Dead Sea is at 300 meters below sea level. So we got back on the bus and started driving down, and around us it is a rocky desert. Most of the year it's hot here. There is not a lot of rain, and so there's not a lot of vegetation. But there is life in the desert, and there are still a lot of animals that can be seen and found if you go for a desert hike. For example, the Nubian Ibex. This is a goat that dwells in the desert. It's a light-colored animal. It has a white part under his belly, and then the males also, they have a dark brown stripe over their backs. And what is so special about the Nubian Ibex is that they have long, thin horns that extend up and then go backwards and then down. And the males, they can have horns that reach up to 1 meter in length. The females have much smaller horns. They are around 30 centimeters only. And they mainly eat grasses and leaves, the things that they find in the desert area. If you listen to last week's episode with Rana about wildlife in Palestine, we also mentioned the hyrax. And in that episode, I said that I saw one and that I thought it was about 0.5 meter, and then I wasn't really sure. Well, I looked it up and they actually get between 30 to 70 centimeters. So the hyrax I saw was probably about 50 centimeters in length. They look like big desert marmots. But actually, and this is very unexpected, the hyrax has a unique honor of being the closest living relative to the elephant. Yeah, the elephant and the hyrax, they are descending from a common ancestor, from a group of mammals that is known as the Tetheria. They died about 50 million years ago, but here you go. It's a quite special animal to spot, the hyrax. And if you're lucky walking in the desert, you can spot the jerboa. Now, jerboas, they look a bit like mini kangaroos. They have some really nice similarities with the kangaroos. They have these long behind legs and very short forelegs, very long tail. They move the tail also when they hop. They move it to balance better. The tail can actually be longer than his head. And they look similar. When the jerboa is hopping, he just looks like a mini kangaroo. Actually, you can see the jerboa in the computer animated comedy film The Star. It's a film from 2017 about Bethlehem and the Nativity story. It's a children's film, but it's also really nice for adults. And there you see one of the characters is a jerboa. So driving through the desert, we are still on our way to Jericho. And in Arabic, Jericho is not called Jericho, but Ariha. And the name of this city is explained in several ways. When you reach the beginning of Jericho, on the roundabout, you see on a pillar an inscription that says Jericho, City of the Moon. Now, this explanation of Jericho meaning City of the Moon comes from the Canaanite times, and then we are talking about 2,000-3,000 before Christ, from the Canaanite word Yareah, which means moon. And Yarich was the name of the god of the moon. Jericho was an early center for worship of the moon. And you can imagine here in the desert that the moon, which is pretty big here in Palestine, would light up brightly and then reflect in the water of the Dead Sea. And it was looked upon by the people as a deity, as a god. But Jericho is also called the city of palms. Jericho has a great climate for growing palm trees. It is warm throughout the year and it has enough water because rainwater that comes down from the mountain ridge area goes to the lowest point, which is in Jericho. So there are lots of springs, natural springs in this area. And in Arabic, riha means smell or fragrance. So imagine the smell here in this part of the country of all the flowers, the blossoms of the fruit trees. There's so many citrus trees here, banana trees, date palms, all kinds of vegetables grow here, corn. Some of the crops, they actually have 2 harvests a year because of the climate and because of the availability of water. And here, for example, the olive harvest in Jericho starts at least a month earlier than in the mountain area because it's so warm that the olives are ripe much earlier. Jericho itself is about 280 meters below the sea level. And it is usually at least 10 degrees Celsius, which is about 50 Fahrenheit, warmer than in Jerusalem. So Jericho has always been a popular winter resort. We know, for example, that King Herod the Great, remember King Herod the Great was the king that lived during the time of Jesus' birth. He had a big winter palace in Jericho. It had pools, a big palace with a bathhouse in Roman style, because this was the time of the Roman occupation of Palestine. And they at least took from them some interesting aspects like the bathhouses and the infrastructure. And he also, Herod the Great, had a summer palace, and that was close to Bethlehem. That's the Herodion, something that you can also visit until today and that I'll speak about in another podcast. But nowadays we see also a lot of Palestinians from other parts of the West Bank and from Jerusalem buying a piece of land in Jericho and building a house with a swimming pool, with a nice garden, so they have a place to spend some time away from the city and to enjoy the mild climate in the winter. And Jericho is the only city that has its own water source under Palestinian control. So in other parts of the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority has to buy the water, even if it comes from aquifers under the West Bank, from Israeli companies, because they do not have permission to pump up the water from the aquifers, which are almost all in Area C, which means under Israeli military control. But in Jericho, the water resources are in Area A under the Palestinian Authority, so they can use the water freely. And that means that Jericho is the only place in the West Bank where you can find a lot of swimming pools. Most of them are open-air swimming pools, and people from all over the West Bank come for the weekends to go swimming in Jericho. And what does Jericho itself look like as a city? Well, it's a bit unexpected. You don't have to think of it as a city with an old town center like Jerusalem or Nablus or Bethlehem. This was a mistake when I came here for the first time, and I went to Jericho and I was looking for the city center, and I didn't find it because there is not an old city center. Jericho has about 30,000 inhabitants, but they are all living in houses quite spread around. There is a kind of town center, but it's not an old city center. There are 2 refugee camps in Jericho. The biggest one is Aqaba Jabir camp. It has about 7,000 people. And then there is a smaller camp called Ain Sultan, which has around 3,500 people. And many of the original Palestinian refugees that were living in the camps, they actually fled to Jordan in 1967 during the atrocities of 1967. But despite the fact that Jericho doesn't have an old city center, it is one of the, or maybe the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. And excavations showed that there are at least 20 layers of civilization on top of each other. You have to imagine it like this. Around 11,000 years ago, when people were still living as hunters and gatherers, going around to look for their food, going around to look for water, they used the natural caves in the mountains, and they exist quite a lot in this area. If you haven't listened to podcast number 2, then you should definitely listen to that one. You'll learn more about the importance of caves in Palestine. So these people were living in caves, they were going around trying to find food, and they were going in the morning down to where the springs were, and then going back up to the cave, and in the afternoon going down to where the springs were because they were thirsty and they needed water, and in the evening, same story. Until one day, one smart person, I like to think that it was a smart woman, realized that why don't we go and live down by the water? We can build our own huts, we can build small houses and live there. And why don't we collect some seeds and we start to grow our own food? Like have some sort of small gardens. And this is the time when people started to experiment with agriculture, growing their own crops, not having to go around hunting for animals and foraging for food, but having their own animals and growing their own food. And this was revolutionary. This is a big step in human evolution when they decided to do this move from the caves down to where the water springs were, to build their own houses, to grow their own food, to domesticate animals. This is a big step in human evolution. And they succeeded. And around 10,000 years ago, they had managed to grow into a larger community, and they even started to protect themselves with a wall. Archaeologists found in Jericho a wall and a 7 meters high tower with an internal staircase dating back to the Neolithic period, about 10,000 years ago, 8,000 before Christ. And you can go and see this because the site of the excavations can be visited, and it's called Tel el Sultan. And Tel means a man-made mound of superimposed cities. So it means that town after town was built on top of each other, and when they were excavating it, they were uncovering all the different layers of those houses. Those houses were made out of bricks, mud bricks, natural stone, and over time there have been earthquakes, there have been attacks, famines, people left the village, new people came and rebuilt it. So we are talking about 20 layers of civilization since about 10,000 years ago. In total, this tell is about 15 meters high, which means that this Neolithic tower that many people come to see, that is 7 meters high, was dug out from the mountain. So when you are climbing the tell to see all the excavations, you are on top of the tell, so you are on one of the newest points, and you're looking down into the area that they have dug open and that they have dug up, and you're looking from up down to an area below where the tower is, and that in that time people lived 15 meters below and were looking up at this 7 meters high tower. It is not clear what exactly this tower was used for. Of course, it could have been for protection, maybe a watchtower watching out for wild animals, because we know that there were more wild animals in Palestine back then than today. Maybe it was to protect against floods, because the water that comes down in the winter from the mountain ridge to the lowest point can come in flash floods. Maybe it was used for storage. There's even suggestions made by some scholars that it was part of the worship of the moon. Whatever it was, we don't know, but we know that this, at that time in human history, was the biggest structure ever built. And then, of course, Jericho is known by many people from the story of the Bible, in which Joshua and the Israelites came from across the Jordan River. They had left Moses behind, and they entered into what they called the Promised Land. And there God had said that they should take the land and not leave anybody alive. Now, the story of Jericho is that the Israelites walked around the city of Jericho for 7 days in silence, and then on the 7th day, they walked around it for 7 times, and then when they blew their trumpets, the walls came falling down, and the Israelites took the city. And they killed everyone except for one woman, a prostitute named Rahab, because she had helped a few days before some Israelite spies when they were checking out the city, and they were almost caught by the people. And according to my teacher at the Bible college, it is believed here that Rahab later married an Israelite and that she was the mother of Boaz. And Boaz lived in Beit Sahor, and he married Ruth. And they are from the line of Joseph, the husband of Mary. So Joseph comes from the line of the prostitute Rahab from Jericho. And this is already a little hint to the Christmas from Bethlehem episode, because Joseph is the husband of Mary, and Mary is the one who gave birth to Jesus in Bethlehem. Now, of course, the archaeologists that were excavating this site, they were very eager to find out if this story from the Bible really happened or not. And of course, scholars do not always agree with each other, but generally, among archaeologists, it is clear that around the time that these Israelites came and invaded the land, around 1400 before Christ, the city of Jericho had already been plundered about 200 years before by other invaders, and there was no wall. The wall already was down, and there were hardly any people living there. So that makes people wonder, then what is this story from the Bible all about? Well, the Palestinian theologians that I speak to, they say that the story of the invasion of Jericho was written in a time that the Jewish people were in exile. They were living in Babylon. They were living under difficult circumstances. And this story was written in a very heroic way, basically in order to give people in that time courage. And that the entrance of the Israelites into this land was probably much more graduate and much more friendly than the stories that were written down in the Bible, because they were written in a time when they needed to feel more strong and they needed to feel courage and have hope for their future. Because archaeology in this land does not show that around that time there was a large-scale destruction of towns and cities. So it seems that happened much more gradually and much more peacefully than is often thought when you read the Old Testament stories. When you are at the Tel El Sultan archaeological site and you look up, you see the cable cars moving up to the Mount of Temptation and back down. My children love going in the cable cars. The cable cars were made by an Austro-Swiss company, and they actually made it into the Guinness Book of Records because they are the longest cable cars operating below the sea level. They are in total length 1,330 meters. And if you are in the cable car, you can see the excavated old city of Jericho from the top. Very nice. But you can also see the remains of the sugar mills. There was a large sugarcane industry in Jericho, very popular, starting from the time of the Umayyads, which was during the Muslim period in Palestine. And then it continued under the Crusaders, and following that with Salah ad-Din during the Ayyubid period, and even after that Mamluk period. So we're talking about the 9th century until the 15th century that there was sugarcane industry in Jericho. Also, from there, you could see down the spring of Elijah. Now, there are many freshwater springs in Jericho, but this one was appointed by the early Christian pilgrims to be the spring where Prophet Elijah came and purified it. This is a story you can read in the Bible in the book of 2 Kings, chapter 2, where the people were complaining to Elijah that the water in the spring was bitter and wasn't pure and that people had gotten sick from it. And then God told Elijah to take salt, throw it in the spring, and the spring became, by miracle, pure and clean and had fresh water. Now, in many occasions in Palestine, which is considered to be the Holy Land, pilgrims who knew the Bible stories and came from abroad to visit the Holy Land, they were looking for those places where did these stories happen. And they have built a lot of churches and chapels on locations that, according to them and according to local tradition, were the exact spots where some of these Bible stories happened. Obviously, it is very hard to have evidence for that, except for what my teacher at the Bible College always says: if there is a very long and old tradition dating back to the 1st, 2nd century after Christ, then it is possible that the first Christians remembered sites where certain events happened. But in many cases, there are also 2, 3, 4 different sites appointed. In this case, one of the fountains appointed to be Elijah's spring. There are several more examples of places that were appointed to be the location of Bible stories. For example, the cable car goes up to the Mount of Temptation. So according to the tradition, this is the place where Jesus was tempted by the devil after he had spent 40 days fasting in the desert. And the devil was trying to make Jesus to follow him, but Jesus resisted all these temptations. And the Crusaders decided, when they came here in the 12th century, that this must be the mountain where that happened, and they even appointed a cave in that mountain. And they called it Mons Quarantania, from 40, because of the 40 days that Jesus spent in the desert. Now, in Arabic, Quarantania slowly changed into Kuruntul, and now this mountain is locally known as Jabal Kuruntul, the mountain of Kuruntul, which means nothing, obviously, which comes from Quaranta. The cable car will take you halfway the mountain, and then you can continue to walk up to the Greek Orthodox monastery, the Monastery of the Temptation. It is built partially into the rocks. It's quite spectacular. The monastery is usually open for visitors, not right now in the Corona time, but generally it is open and you can visit a cave inside that is said to be the cave where Jesus stayed when he was tempted. And there is even a stone that is indicated as the stone where he sat when the devil spoke to him. The monastery itself dates from the 19th century. It's not very old. There is a cafe there and a restaurant, some souvenir shops at this location. So it is very nice to visit. My children love it, especially the ice cream that they can get in the cafe halfway up the mountain. Another example of a location appointed to be part of a Bible story is the sycamore tree closer to the city center, where, according to the story, the toll or tax collector Zacchaeus hid when Jesus was coming into the town. It's a very big tree. It's a bit a crossing between a fig tree and a mulberry tree, the sycamore tree, and it is not very common, this tree in this area, which may actually be part of the Bible story, because in this story a tax collector, who is not really loved by the people because he was taking money from the people to give to the Romans, and turns out that he also stole a lot of money from the people. So he's different. He's also very short. So he's a different guy. And he gets into this tree, which is also a pretty different tree from the trees that we see generally in Palestine. And he hides in the tree because he wants to see Jesus, who is passing through Jericho. And then Jesus stops and he looks up and he sees Zacchaeus and he knows who he is. And he tells him, "I want to have the dinner with you in your home." And all the people around him are very shocked, because why does Jesus choose this man to eat with him in his house? He's a bad guy. He's a tax collector. He's a thief. But then Jesus says that he didn't come for those who already live a good life. He comes for those who are lost, to save them. And actually Zacchaeus then decides to give everyone back what he stole from them, 4 times the amount. So it's a good ending of the story, and it's a very well-known story here in Jericho. A lot of people come to visit to take pictures of the tree, and generally you will find a lot of Palestinian fruit sellers around selling bananas, fresh from the plantation, selling fresh fruit juices, dates, and other local produce. So it's worth a visit. There is also another tree that is said to be the real sycamore tree, which is on the Russian compound, because close to it there's a beautiful garden with a beautiful building, which is the Russian Museum. This museum was built in late 19th century when Russians purchased this land from the French. And inside the museum there is a photo exhibition that shows how Russian pilgrims used to spend up to 6 months to reach the Holy Land by land. So they'd walk and they'd take trains until they reached here. They'd celebrate the Christmas and then they'd stay until Easter. And after the Easter, they would return back overland back to Russia. So that would take them up to about 6 months. And they came with hundreds of people at the same time. So that's a photo exhibition you can see in the museum. But you can also see archaeological findings, such as oil lamps and jars and pottery and a lot of mosaics found during excavations in Jericho. Now, in the city center of Jericho, there are many places where you can go to eat something. It's very nice. People are very friendly. Everything is quite flat, and it's therefore very easy to go on bikes. There are several bike rental shops where you can rent a bike and go around for a bike ride. Another must-see place in Jericho is Hesham's palace. In Arabic, Khirbet al-Mafjar. Hesham's palace is a desert palace dating back to the Umayyad time. The Umayyad time is in the 8th century, when Palestine had become part of the expanding Muslim world since the 7th century. In 638, Jerusalem became under the Muslim rule with Umar ibn al-Khattab. And since then, it remained under the different Muslim dynasties until the Crusader kingdom in the 12th century. And in the time of the Umayyad dynasty in the 8th century, many desert palaces have been built in the area of Syria, Jordan, and Palestine. And scholars do not have one single theory for why these palaces were built in the desert and what their use exactly was. But it is obvious that these desert palaces had walls and towers to protect the palace, that they all had water reservoirs to collect and keep rainwater, and that they had indicated areas for agriculture to grow their own food. And maybe they were used as winter palaces for the caliphs to enjoy the warm climate. Maybe they were also used as meeting places so they could meet with the leaders of the different Bedouin tribes to make treaties, for example. But what we know for sure is that Hisham's palace was a place of luxury. The palace is often attributed to the 10th caliph, Hesham ibn Abdul Malik, but scholars say that he was a very pious man, and they think it's pretty unlikely that he would have spent so much money on embellishing this palace so much. But his nephew, who ruled after him for only 1 year until he was assassinated, his name was Walid II, and he was known for his love of a more lavish life, for his love for women and drinking. And now it is thought that the palace maybe grew so decorated and majestic under Walid's short rule. Maybe Hesham started building the palace and his nephew Walid finished it off. But for sure it is clear that Hisham's palace is an outstanding example of one of those desert palaces that were built in the Umayyad time. What remains of this palace is mainly ruins, and that is because in 749 there was a big earthquake that hit Palestine. Many buildings in 749 have been destroyed, including this palace. But what you can see when you visit it is spectacular mosaic floors of the bathhouse. There was a bathhouse, very big, with a pool, with niches around it where people could sit and relax. And these bathhouses were often places where they would come not only to clean themselves and to relax, but also to have social meetings, getting guests to be comfortable enough to make good deals and to make treaties. And the floor of the bathhouse was warmed by a hippocaust system. And the hippocaust system, we know it from the Greek and Roman times, was an underfloor heating system where warm air would be channeled under the floor to warm it up. And this floor is decorated with 38 different mosaic carpets. It's beautiful. Last time I was there, they covered it with sand to protect it from the sun and the rain. Right now they are working with the Japanese on a protective shield to protect the whole archaeological site. It is now partially closed for visitors, but when it opens again, they will have renovated the whole area, made a walking path so that you can see all the different archaeological excavations. And you will see that it was beautifully decorated with lots of mosaics, stucco, sculptures, frescoes, carved stones. And it's a very unique style because they were combining what they knew from the Byzantines and from the Persians, the Sasanians. And this is a beautiful example of how the early Islamic architecture and art was developing. Also very beautiful and special is close to the bathhouse, there was a reception room that was called the Diwan, and this was where the caliph would receive his special guests. And there is an incredible mosaic there of the tree of life. You see a beautiful tree, and then you see two gazelles that are eating from the grass. They are innocent, they are not expecting anything, but from their back there is a lion coming to attack the gazelles. And some scholars think that this was a warning for people coming into the Diwan to realize that the Umayyad Caliph was a mighty, powerful man and that you shouldn't play with him. Others think that it was Walid II, who was a real womanizer, who used the Diwan to receive some of his female guests and to give them that impression that he was the strong lion and they were the beautiful gazelles. Because he also wrote poetry, and in his poetry he used to refer to gazelles when he wanted to describe beautiful women. Whatever the meaning was of this mosaic, it's still in a very good shape and it is beautiful. And if you visit Hisham's palace, you will be able to see it. Now, the site was discovered in 1894, but it took about 40 years until they started with real archaeological excavations. And that was in the time of the British Mandate. There was a Palestinian archaeologist, one of very few famous Palestinian archaeologists who was working on the site. His name is Dr. Baramki. But unfortunately, his British colleague, Mr. Robert Hamilton, published an important work on the findings at Hesham's palace. He called it Khirbat al-Mafjar, an Arab mansion in the Jordanian Valley. But in this publication, he did not include the archaeological research of Dr. Baramki. So obviously that made Dr. Baramki very disappointed and upset. And it is very good that he did publish his research and all the archaeological aspects of the site in reports and articles separately in the quarterly of the Palestinian Department of Antiquities. Because in Hamilton's publication, he only wrote about the art history, let's say. He did not include much about the archaeological findings. Many of the findings are now in the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem. This is actually the first Palestinian archaeological museum. It was founded by a rich American philanthropist called John Rockefeller. He was a businessman, very rich. He became very rich in oil, and he supported the Archaeological Museum of Palestine. So currently Hesham's palace is under renovation, and it is also now on the tentative list of UNESCO World Heritage Sites, together with the Tel El Sultan and the Monastery of Temptation. Hopefully by the time that you will be able to come and visit us in Palestine, Hesham's palace will be open and we can all enjoy the beauty of this Umayyad desert palace. And every week we learn a couple of words in Arabic from Louisa and Hadi. Louisa, how do you say in Arabic desert?
صحراء.
And how do you say moon in Arabic?
قمر.
And sun?
شمس.
We talked about Hesham's palace. It's a castle. How do you say castle?
قصر.
Hadi, Sahra.
صحراء.
Qamar.
قمر.
Shams.
شمس.
Qasr.
قصر.
Shukran, Hadi and Louisa. Thank you for listening to this podcast episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And I would like to remind you that if you want to support the podcast this month, you can send a donation and I will send the link to the special Christmas from Bethlehem podcast to you, your friends, and your family. In this way, you can enjoy Christmas in Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus, and we can get the word out about Stories from Palestine podcast. Check out the website storiesfrompalestine.info for all the information, and I hope you will listen again next week.